sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be love. Love means understanding, redemptive goodwill toward all, which seeks nothing in return. So be love by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be love by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be love and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be love and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be love and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be love and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Hello, welcome to our broadcast this evening. We're excited to have you with us for this conversation. We believe still at the King Center that conversation is a critical part, courageous conversations rather, of how we move humanity forward. And we continue to believe that, as Dr. King reiterated to us in his time here on earth, that often our emotions we feel towards each other, whether that's hate or fear, come because we don't communicate. So to that end, we continue to have beloved community talks with the goal of leading to tangible action, tangible engagement, and tangible change. Or, as our King Holiday theme for this year says, we're aiming to cultivate a beloved community mindset to transform unjust systems. So, welcome from New Orleans, welcome from Michigan, wherever you're joining us for this conversation. Of course, in our understanding that we must continue to talk about the issues that are before us and talk about them in a way that gets us to that tangible change, we realize that sometimes we make plans and then something happens in the world. As we witnessed last week, as the video was released of Tyre Nichols being brutally beaten by Memphis police officers, eventually leading to his death. As we discuss tonight why all the tension, the relationship between Black and Jewish communities, we're cognizant of the fact that that is still very much on the minds of people who may be watching. And so our CEO of the King Center, Dr. Bernice King, will join us at the beginning of this broadcast to share some of her thoughts, or for us rather to talk about some of her thoughts and questions after we view, the world has viewed. Some of us choosing not to, for our own health and mental health and to avoid the trauma of it. But for those of us who have seen it, who witnessed it, and who didn't need to see it to know how awful it was just based off description, to talk about the tangible work that we can do, but also to consider the mindset that needs to shift. So I'm going to ask and invite Dr. Bernice King, CEO of the King Center, global thought leader, change maker, to come on now and to just let's talk about it. We, of course, at the King Center will have some conversations in the future, as we have in the past, around policing in this nation. But Dr. King, we absolutely want to not start this conversation on this very important topic without discussing what's on the minds of so many people across the world. So just want to invite you in to share your initial thoughts. I know you have just questions and feelings, as we all do, to express about the horror of what we witnessed via video. So, Dr. King, you're muted there.
Welcome. Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you so much. And let me also express my gratitude to you again for agreeing to host this Beloved Community Talks and to represent the King Center in this fashion. We just appreciate your deep commitment to the King legacy and the teachings around nonviolence in particular. Secondly, I want to express, obviously, my condolences. And, you know, people say we're tired of hearing about prayers, and I get that. But sometimes the prayers are also for us, so that we can stay in the right frame of mind as we pray for the family and pray for our society and pray for, you know, pray for the mind of God and the strategy of God to really address what seems to be a cycle that we cannot come out of, or that we refuse to come out of, that we have not come out of. And, you know, there's a barrage of emotions that so many of us feel in this hour, and it's packing on. You know, we're in a country where so many people are very traumatized, some to a greater degree than others. Arguably, those of us in the Black community have experienced trauma on top of trauma that seems to not stop. It seems like it's endless, you know, and we have to live with it over and over again. To my indigenous brothers and sisters, you know, and this, you know, we say it has to stop, but to be honest with you, it's not going to stop tomorrow, the next day, or the next day. But what can happen is that we individually, as well as collectively, in terms of whatever groups, organizations, associations that we are part of, can really begin to do some soul searching and pray for a different mind in all of this. You know, Albert Einstein said, you know, problems cannot be solved on the same level of thinking in which we've created them. And so there's a shift in the way we think on an everyday basis, you know, in terms of how we address these issues, and how we create and reimagine a society where the dignity and value and worth of every individual is regarded and is respected, you know, in our interactions, engagements, in our policy making, and, you know, and so, you know, that's where I am. When we talked about this over the last few days, I told you I just have more questions than I really have answers, because I'm frustrated with the cycle. You know, I watch the cycle over and over again. You know, these horrific things take place. You know, we go through the commentary about it. You know, we call in the experts from law enforcement, you know, the legal community, you know, the civic community. We see, you know, the various protests and the outcry. You know, we hear about, you know, calling for, you know, peaceful protests and nonviolent, you know, protests. And, you know, I get all of that, but it's like, at what point do we stop and say, okay, what are we not getting?
Right.
You know, we have all these suggestions. We need more training. We need to get those, you know, the legislation policy, the George Floyd,
Justice and Policing Act.
Justice and Policing Act, you know, passed. And all of these things are so true, but there's still something we are fundamentally missing. And yes, we need more, you know, responsible gun laws. But there's just something fundamentally missing. And one of the areas that I think we talk little about is what I just expressed, and that is the trauma. Um, you know, there's no excuses. Let me start there first. There's no excuses for what happened yesterday, what has happened over and over again in society between some law enforcement officers and members of the Black community, the Brown community, the Indigenous community. I don't want to say BIPOC because I want to be intentional with my words there. So the Black community, Indigenous community, the Brown community, and our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters. There's no excuse for the way in which we approach people, and we need systemic change, of course. I'm not sure that systemic change equates to ridding ourselves of everything. I'm just not sure how that will go. I don't know if it will create anarchy. I don't know. I mean, it's just that you can't create order, and you can't create what's righteous out of chaos. So there has to be something that we are not tapped into yet. We know there has to be change. We know the system is working the way it intended from the beginning. So it's not broken. It just, unfortunately, we keep trying to operate the system we started from the very beginning.
Sure. But Dr. King, the system, though, is comprised of people.
Yes.
And the more I think about systems, the more I think that we often talk about them as though people aren't complicit in the system. Sometimes, maybe unknowingly, but oftentimes aware that something is unjust. And we, chose as a theme this year, cultivating a beloved community mindset. One of the things that we witnessed is the strategy that went into how people would respond to this video of Tyre Nichols being beaten by police. Like, what time do businesses need to close? What time do we need to release the video? What time do we need for this to happen in order for there not to be more violence? More strategy, I would venture to say, went into planning for a response than goes into ensuring that policing isn't detrimental to communities. What needs to shift in our mindset in how we care about each other? One of the things your dad mentioned is being other-centered. How important is it now as we think about changing our minds, cultivating a different way of thinking? You look at that video, we saw human beings who clearly weren't other-centered when it came to Tyre Nichols. What do we do with that? I know we have questions, and I know that's one of our questions. And as I share with you, questions are okay. We all need to answer them together.
Yeah. I think that's why the work that we're doing is so important, and sometimes we sound like a broken record, and, in a society that is so accustomed to violence and feels like the only way that those who perpetuate systemic, cultural, oppressive is kind of oxymoron to say oppressive violence, but these forms of violence is to react in kind, because, at least it gets your attention, at least it lets you know we're not going to take this. I think that's the sentiment. But the problem with that is it still has not moved the needle towards what our heart's desire is, which is to, number one, to be seen as created in the image and likeness of God, as a human being or a spirit being having a human experience, respected in our personhood. Even when there may be a violation of a law, there is still a manner in which I can be addressed and handled, and so this mindset of trying to understand that we are all connected to each other in our humanity is so hard to push when people have been so harmful and hurtful toward us. But nonviolence, the training of it, the discipline of it, helps to refocus, our energy and efforts so that we can make headway into creating substantial change. It also helps to work on the hearts of people. Going into this, there was a time when I thought about, well, it doesn't, it doesn't help, it doesn't work, because other people don't change, until I realized this is more about me when I'm embracing nonviolence than it is about the other person. And what I'm doing in the atmosphere, I'm creating an atmosphere for the best of that person to show up, because it's easy for us to feed into the worst of people that already is there. If you feed, something a certain way negatively, the output is gonna continue to be the same. So I'm trying to put something else in the atmosphere so that what I know is inside of every human being, regardless of the damage that's been caused in their life, through various experiences. Because remember, we all were infants. We had no hate.
Yeah.
We
weren't born this way.
We weren't born with all these experiences, exposures, and conditioning and all that kind of stuff. So I'm calling for that to come out of people. And that's why nonviolence is so important. And so that I don't become that. I don't want to become my adversary or my opponent. I want to be in a position that I'm elevating, that person who is, mishandling the way in which, God created them originally to be and to perform and to act. But, I just think, this is what we have to understand. This is not expedient. Sometimes I think when we're trying to process through all of this, we're looking for that expedient response. When I listen to conversations, from leaders in government in particular, in cities trying to address violence, we want the expedient route because we think if we just put this in place, it'll stop. This is long haul work. We're dealing with human emotions, that really are spilling out into society right now. There's something fundamentally wrong in the emotional intelligence of our nation that we have to begin to address.
True.
We're smart, intellectually, cognitively, but emotionally, we are very deficient. And a lot of it is that we have not respected how to handle trauma appropriately in this society. And trauma comes personally. We all have our own personal traumas in our own homes, our own communities, etc. We got these social, traumas as society. When this happened, this traumatized those of us who were not the family of Tyree Nichols in terms of biologically, but it affected us as his human family. It's traumatic. For those of us who may have had our own traumatic experiences with law enforcement, it all feeds into all of that. And we've put nothing in place to continue to address that over and over again, even for law enforcement officers. And I'm not taking up for them, but I say every day to myself, I can't imagine being in law enforcement in a society where guns are all in the marketplace freely. And in some states, there are no, responsible gun laws, and you can just get it without a license, like in our state of Georgia. I can't imagine being in law enforcement trying to protect and serve in that kind of environment. What trauma is that for some when they show up every day? The trauma that they come out of their own lives and they bring into the work, as well as those mindsets that they bring because they perhaps as a child grew up in an environment where their family, neglected them and abused them, and they joined some of these hate groups or whatever, and those hate groups help to develop and process them, and now, they're they're using the badge, to react and respond. I can't imagine all of this. If an officer ends up, shooting a weapon, what happens? They go right back in like it's normal. It's not normal. I don't care if it's what we call justified or in self-defense. It is not normal to kill another human being. When I saw the Planet of the Apes, and I said this before, and people thought I was crazy. I'm trying to remember which one it was, but when they said apes don't kill apes, can you still hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Yes.
Apes don't kill apes. It hit me in my core because I heard humans don't kill humans. It didn't say anything about, well, except, well, it depends. It just said apes don't kill apes. And so the mindset to get us to a place, because honestly, y'all, the guns are here. They ain't going nowhere. They're not going to evaporate. There's no metal coming out of the sky. No, what is that thing called? A magnet coming out of the sky to draw them up and out.
Swoop them all up.
It's not here. So we got to put laws in place, but we got to keep doing the heart work and the transformation of the mind. And that's not expedient.
Dr. King, what you just shared is so important. And I want people out there to tweet and share with the understanding that we're smart, but we're emotionally deficient. Mm-hmm. Dr. King said that. And she also just shared something that may be a difficult concept for many of us, considering the person who we think is on the opposing side. When I heard you talk about what may be happening with law enforcement, sometimes the first instinct is to say, totally disregard hundreds of thousands of people who are in law enforcement and disregard what they bring to their positions. But in doing that, first of all, in nonviolence, we believe we have to attack issues and not people. So somehow we have to come to the table and say, why do these issues persist? And we can't do it without the other person and the other people. To think we can is not only erroneous, but it takes some of our organization away. One of the quotes that we've been talking about is your father saying, those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war. When we have a emotional intelligence deficit, how does that impact our ability to organize? How does it stop us from organizing if we're not intelligent emotionally?
Externally, we will go through the actions, but every step of the way, the saboteur is right there. The sabotage is there, because if that emotion becomes the guide, if it becomes the compass, if it becomes the barometer for your actions and your strategy and your thinking, then the outcome is not going to be what we're looking for, which is we're looking for justice, we're looking for righteous outcomes, we're looking for creating the possibility of a pathway towards reconciliation, we're looking for correction that leads to restoration, that leads to rehabilitation, and that leads to perhaps new types of relationships. So there's some kind of way we've got to deal with this. I delivered a message years ago. I preached a sermon called "Deal with It" with Cain and Abel, and the one thing I saw, that if we don't deal with it, when you don't deal with it, and that it is a lot of things as it relates to all of us. Our it's are all different, but when we don't deal with it, it shows up at different points in our life, and it will deal with you. And so that happens over and over again. So, I just hope that we will learn something valuable from the Eastern culture in terms of balancing some of our pace in this world. We're on this cycle, this capitalistic cycle, this materialistic cycle, just running, trying to chase. And we forget that we are full of emotions, we're full of thoughts, you know what I'm saying? And do we take time to address those, to audit those, to nurture things, to purge of things? It's just so much that we need to start doing, because we're moving and we're just packing it in, and explosion. And I guess for me, it's like, I'm ready to see something different, different. I'm tired of violence, I'm fed up with it. It's the worst of us, and I'm also just very tired of seeing, and I'm going to be a little selfish or self-centeredness. I'm just tired of what's happening to my Black brothers and sisters, to our community over and over again. We've been going through a long time. But I did say to an audience the other day, I also think we're called. And that's hard to grasp. I do think there's something peculiar about the ones who were sold into from their own brothers and sisters, and even snatched and brought from Africa in chains, some that didn't make it. I'm not saying anybody else doesn't have anything, but I think there's a peculiar calling on Blacks in America. And it doesn't mean we have to endlessly suffer, but I think the call is teaching us, how we address ugliness and hate, and evil, because people need to know how to do that. Because, let's just be frank. Daddy was absolutely right. Violence cannot put out violence. It can't wipe it out. It can't. It's just it continues. It's a descending spiral, and it just goes back and forth. Hate, same thing. So who's going to be the one, as my mother said, to cut off those chains of hate and violence? And I think there's something that we can teach through our unfortunate struggle. And I think that's what Dr. King was showing us. There is another way, because he was not above all of this. He had to face many of these things he was not an exception. He lived through some horrific things.
Absolutely. And dealt with the trauma of it.
Yes,
Dr. King, as you mentioned trauma, I was reading your mom's memoir this morning, and she's talking about your dad praying at the kitchen table as he was dealing with his own trauma and his own devastation and his own misgivings about leading a movement in the face of violence. So the things that we're seeing today are things that he experienced at that kitchen table and at other points in his life.
And he figured out how to channel stuff into a way that was much more powerful and constructive out of a love-centered place. And so, but it's a lot. It's a lot of questions. And I don't think anybody has the answer. But I do know that when we realign ourselves with the right beloved community mindset, I think we have a prescription through nonviolence to really adequately create some outcomes that will be much more sustainable and healthy for us as a society and world.
Dr. King, Rovon Wells, Tyre Nichols' mom, and we've seen her on interviews sharing her devastation. I wanted to, as we close out this segment with you, be sure you had an opportunity to express anything you'd like to share with her in terms of your condolences and prayers for her and her family.
Yeah, her and her family. His
son,
has children. My heart really goes out always to the children because of what happened to me when I was 5. So I just want to extend my love and prayers and condolences and solidarity with her and the entire family. This is not an easy pathway. It's not a club, as we say, that anyone wants to be a part of. But know that I'm getting ready to be a preacher on this platform. I have permission every now and then, but what the devil or the enemy or badness meant, God is going to turn some good out of this. And I believe that. But we do have to do the work of strategy and coalition and coordinating and consistency. One day we'll come back and talk about that press and consistency, because we kind of get into it and we let up. We get an opening and then, we just kind of slip right back into, and the cycle continues. So we got to break that cycle and break this chain of violence.
Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you, Dr. West. And thank our guest tonight for being with us. Looking forward to hearing the discussion.
Thank you. Wow. That was a powerful, wasn't even full 30 minutes. Just to reiterate as we go into this conversation this evening, some of the things that Dr. King shared. In nonviolence, we believe that when we find ourselves in traumatic circumstances, we're not saying that it's okay. We're not saying that we did anything to bring it on. But when we're there, we have to figure out what our response will be. And as Dr. King was sharing, I was thinking about the choice, that I have a choice to participate in, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, violent co-annihilation or nonviolent coexistence. And in facing that choice, I have to determine how I respond to trauma, how I respond to pain. And that's so difficult, right? Because in our minds, we're thinking, I shouldn't even be in this situation. Rovon Wells shouldn't even be in this situation, but she's there. And when you see her on the news, what you're witnessing is a human being who has said, since I'm here, let me say something that will not add to the descending spiral of violence. Let me say something that will lift and will elevate, that will not acquiesce to injustice, but that will call us into justice and what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called true peace. A lot of times we're calling for false or negative peace, but he believed we could get to true peace, which is not merely the absence of tension, but it's the presence of justice. As we go into this conversation on why all the tension, the relationship between the Black and Jewish communities, we want you to remember, we don't think there's anything wrong with tension. We believe that there's a creative tension, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned, that can get us to the place we want to be at as human beings. So what we want to talk about this evening where we are, if you're joining us from all over the world, it may be a different time, but we want to talk about this tension that we hope will galvanize us towards some joint action to create the beloved community across the globe. And so in that vein, I want to welcome our first guest for this conversation, Rabbi Jason Kilmerman Block, who is the Washington director for an organization called Bend the Arc, Jewish Action. And he's going to come on now, Rabbi Jason. We're going to talk about this kind of intersection between our communities. But first, welcome, Rabbi. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Dr. West. It's an honor to be here. And just want to say that the conversation you just had with Dr. King was so moving. And when I think about Tyre Nichols, I think his murder was an abomination that we witnessed.
Absolutely.
And we pray that his memory will be a blessing, as we say in the Jewish tradition. And I think about how many people we can say that about. We said that about George Floyd, we said that about Dr. King, we said about Malcolm X, Heather Heyer, how many, how long do we have to do this, especially at the hands of the state?
The hands of the state. Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to mention to Dr. King. We didn't get an opportunity to, is kind of the history of policing in this nation and how it's rooted in so much racism and hate and violence. And if we never went back to address it or to change it, the spirit of it, then I believe that's why we're still here dealing with it, because we kind of think we don't have to deal with history. Right. We can just show up with good intentions and everything will be okay, but that's not true. What we don't deal with, it comes back. When I look at your work, Rabbi, and I watch and I read about the things that you're standing for with Bend the Arc, I'm reminded of the importance of our interconnectedness, that you're standing for immigration reform, for issues that concern Black people in this nation, I just want to ask you, because as Dr. King said, and she said in her call to commemoration on MLK Day a few weeks ago too, she said, I'm exhausted. I'm tired. We use my father's name, but we're not living king.
Right.
Why is that important right now with Bend the Arc and with what Dr. King taught about this moral arc? In one place he says the arc of the moral universe, and another place he says the moral arc of the universe. But what he's talking about is this bend towards justice. I want to just pose to you as the first question: why is it important for us to bend the arc together as Black and Jewish people?
Oh, it's such a rich question. I mean, first of all, I think that's the command of every human being. I think that's the inheritance we have as spiritual people, just as human beings, that we have to work, as Dr. King said, to ensure that we're all treated in the image of God with the infinite dignity that we deserve. In terms of like our specific context, and I think your question about why the tension is really rich and provocative, in the best way. Let's talk about some of these things. The first thing I want to say is, just to lift up for folks as we saw during part one of the conversation with, my good friend April Baskin, who I've known for many, many years. Black and Jewish are not binaries, right? They're overlapping communities. Hundreds of thousands of Black Jews in the United States. People often think of Jews, and Jews often think of Jews as predominant, as white, as that being kind of co-equivalent, and it's just not true. It's actually more Jews of color in the United States than Orthodox Jews. So it's just like one piece that I want to set as a frame.
Thank you.
But we live in a society, we live in a civilization where white supremacy is just something that we're taught, right? And something that we're all taught. And the idea of white superiority or just any human hierarchy really is a form of idolatry, as I see it. But that certainly anti-Black racism is like at the core of white supremacy. But white supremacy means all kinds of things, and addresses all kinds of is at the root of all kinds of bigotries in this country. Xenophobia is largely around white supremacy, and anti-Semitism as well. And it denies our humanity in different ways. We can get into that later. But in some ways, we have to, there needs to be, a coalition of all people who are targeted to unravel that system. And because there's no way for any one of us to get free without all of us.
Thank you for that. I was looking at Fannie Lou Hamer's quote today. Nobody's free until everybody's free.
Exactly.
It's true. That quote, which Dr. King paraphrased, when he talks about the moral arc of the universe, it connects back to the sixth principle of nonviolence, which is the universe is on the side of justice. It's a foundational, I believe, spiritual and faith belief from people of various backgrounds. But also when we teach nonviolence, we share that even if you don't have a faith per se, if you're atheist, you can believe the universe is on the side of justice. I think what Dr. King and Bernice King and I discussed is the absence of sometimes faith groups in justice work. And particularly as we talk about the relationship between Black and Jewish communities, what role do you think faith groups and faith leadership play in healing, in authentic reconciliation, and then also in getting us to bend this arc together and to care about anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism at the same time?
Yeah. Oh, it's so crucial.
Mhm.
The first thing I would say, just like one comment about just that idea of the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice. Dr. King, when he said it, he was paraphrasing Reverend Theodore Parker, who was an abolitionist, who, in his phrasing of said it's like he's not sure. He says it with uncertainty. And I was looking up, he gave that sermon in 1853. When we think about
Wow.
that political moment, like, of course you're not sure. Think about, what was you know, whether things could actually improve in any way. King said it with confidence. It does, right?
Yeah.
And we're trying to say it with as a call to action. Like, we got to bend it, right? It's not going to bend unless we bend it, and that's kind of the call to for us, it's a call to the Jewish community, but I think that's a call for all faith communities. I think that there's and to talk about your question, I think there's multiple ways that the faith community absolutely must be a part of this movement and this work. One is that it's at the core of our religious obligations, right? Like, how can you be a person of faith? How can you say you worship God and also worship, some idolatrous image of what a human being is supposed to look like? How can you say that, how can you worship God and worship the acquisition of things and the putting money and profits over human beings, right? So there's like a religious call there. Also, in terms of like the systems that need to be unraveled in this country, it's not just like fringe white supremacist groups. It's not just the people who are kind of building their own power by division and fear. Like, we all absorb those toxic systems in ourselves. So, we internalize oppression against us. We internalize oppression towards, people in other groups. So it's not just a political process, although it is, but it's also a spiritual process to dismantle those systems.
True. How do we share experiences? Rabbi, when I visit the Holocaust Museum in DC, it is 3 times my family has told me I should never go back. Because each time I've gone, I've had to sit by the door sobbing, just absolutely devastated.
Yeah.
When I go to the door of no return, Cape Coast, Ghana, and I stand there, I've left there sobbing, devastated. And in essence, my friends are saying, girl, stay away from these places. But I believe in those moments, what I'm feeling is a sense of, I can't believe we did this to each other as human beings. And it's unimaginable. The pain, the grief, the horror, still the trauma that results from those atrocities today. And then I think the real devastation for me is we're in danger of doing it again,
right,
because of how we still engage and treat each other today. But then I think about the relationship today between Black and Jewish people, and sometimes a lot of tension.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if we think of the other as ourselves, which is a hard concept, we would bend that arc together. So as we close out this segment, we use this big word, intersectionality, I think, to simply say we should consider the other as ourselves and realize that we're connected in spiritual ways and tangible ways. How do we, as we think about this tension that sometimes exists, get to thinking of my Jewish neighbor as me and myself as my Jewish neighbor, and this idea of we're interrelated? That's very real. People think it's just spiritual, but it's very real in terms of economics and all other sectors of society. How would that help us bend the arc?
Mm-hmm.
This idea of interrelatedness and intersectionality.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you getting all the deep questions on the
It's
front.
so, and no, it's great. I love this. I love this conversation so much. I want to say that one thing I'm thinking about is just the understanding of history, as you were saying. Just like what are our stories?
Mhm.
And yeah, like of course there's commonality, and there's some commonality in trauma, but like all of our stories are truly unique.
Yes.
And there's specificity there that I think is really, really important. Um, and not to, we want to be in coalition. We want to, understand and work together. And we don't want to paper over differences. And I think the beauty of like the teachings of intersectionality is the idea that none of us are always oppressors or always victims. In different contexts, I mean, I've got a lot of oppressive identities as kind of a straight white man, right? But in some contexts, as a Jewish person in relation to a Christian person, I might be in a position of of disadvantage in some way. But so I think, without papering over the differences and all the things that we hold, really as much as we can, like hearing each other's individual and collective stories of what does it mean to be me.
Thank you, Rabbi. When you come back for the closing segment, we'll talk a bit about coalitions and how we can work together, and how we might be able to collectively address trauma, because there are different traumas that come from these atrocities, different outcomes, very horrible, all of them, but the trauma and the outcome may be a bit different. So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation, this series of conversations, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi. Next, we have Wendell Shelby Wallace, who's joining us as a guest who's a special advisor to the Consulate General of Israel. And we just want to continue this conversation, keep it going, this series of conversations, rather, as we discuss why all the tension. And as Wendell is coming, I want to encourage you, if you're watching, to invite people to watch this with you, to tweet about it, to share about it. We may be saying conversations don't matter, but they do, because we can't even get to the work until we work through some of these things that we struggle with as human beings. And so that's why we're here. We want these conversations to lead to tangible work. And again, as our theme for the year says, 2023 King Center theme, cultivating, it starts with me, cultivating a beloved community mindset to transform unjust systems. So let's welcome now Wendell Shelby Wallace.
Good evening.
Welcome. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dr. West.
Thank you. What are you thinking? What are your thoughts about the conversation so far and the opening with Dr. King? And
I grew up studying King from afar, and then attended Morehouse, where I had a deep dive, as we call it, into King and the King family. But I've always been most impressed by Dr. King, Dr. Bernice King, and the carrying of her father's legacy, and living in present. And in fact, I was just rereading Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, in which Dr. King in the 1960s has outlined basically what the future generations will inherit. And it's just such a a blessing and a privilege to witness what he wrote about taking place today. But I also think that, you know, as I'm reading this book from the 1960s, here it is 2023, and we're dealing with some of the same things, right? In the book, he actually talks about, there's a quote where he talks about some future historian, right? He says some future historian is going to have to say that a great civilization, essentially it lacked the moral compass, right? To act. And so I've been spending a lot of this new year. I can't believe we're just entering into 2023, and so much has happened already.
Yes.
Thinking about like how I might act, right? It's interesting that we open up this conversation today, and we're you know, calling into remembrance what's happened most recently with Tyre Nichols. He and I are the same exact age, right? And so thinking about the fact that, you know, that his mother could have very well been my mother, right? His legacy could have very well been my legacy. And, you know, remembering that we almost have a responsibility to act in this moment, right? And you're right, the conversations are not necessary, but the conversations are important because that's how we start. That's where our think tank happens. That's where, you know, we're all coming together. We don't know, you know, truthfully, you know, as you were saying earlier, oftentimes we're left with more questions than we are with answers. And the answers truly come when we come together for these types of conversations.
Thank you for that. Now, I want to be sure, because you mentioned a book that really matters. And I want to share with the audience the book that Wendell mentioned is Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's his last book, published in 1967. We want to invite you always to read that book. He talked about the World House chapter, where Dr. King writes about us living in this great world house that we've inherited. Very appropriate and applicable to what we're discussing here, because sometimes in our world house, Wendell, there's tension and there's friction, and we have to figure out what to do. So I just want to hear your answer to the question that is the title of this conversation, this Beloved Community Talks. Why all the tension? When you think about some of the things that we often encounter and the tension we may feel between Black and Jewish communities, you know, are in a space where it may be magnified for you and may be a little strange talking about tension between the two communities. But why all the tension? What is it that happens? And this is a very important question, I think, as Rabbi Jason pointed out. We're all fighting against white supremacy. So why all the tension? And I want to ask you this. Do you think it's a distraction from us defeating the real enemy? Which is this idea that the white race is a supreme race.
Absolutely. So I think we sort of kind of answered why all the tension, right? The tension has rested since the founding of the modern nation of the United States of America. The tension has rested in the idea of one race being more supreme than the other, and that is the idea of white supremacy. I think particularly as we talk about the tension between the African American and Jewish community, one thing we have to call into our framework, as Rabbi mentioned, is that in more contemporary times, there doesn't seem to be a separation between whiteness and Jewishness in the average minds of most Americans, right? So,
absolutely.
And so Black people don't necessarily see Jewish because race is, you know, even though it, you know, we say that it's not a, you know, binary construct, in its social constructive form, race is Black and white in the United States of America. And so, you know, we add in the brown, we add in the other things, but primarily when it concerns white supremacy, at its core, race is this or that, right? It's the otherness. And so I think, you know, the why the tension, that's the why. The why is the white supremacy. Is it a distraction? Absolutely so. I think that as we attempt to make any type of progress inside of in this nation, these type of distractions continuously appear. We see the progress that we had. You know, I'm somewhat of a history geek. We see the progress that we had with the Civil Rights Alliance. We see the progress that we had specifically with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. We see the progress that was made, but it was made between the coalitions of African Americans and Jews, right? They understood that one would not make progress without the other. I think that the divisiveness that has been set into place when we see certain comments being made by mainstream celebrities, I see the divisiveness that has been put into place is literally counterproductive to the progress that we could have as within both communities. I was just this past weekend, I had a little bit of time, which is rare, to watch a Netflix movie, and I watched You People.
You People.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I gotta be honest, the movie is what we call a first half movie. The beginning part of it was much better than the ending part of it. But I did appreciate the honesty that occurred within the movie of how both communities felt about the other. And you Dr. West, you speak of the moment that you've had at the Holocaust Museum in Washington D.C. I've had the opportunity to visit Israel numerous amount of times, over about 6 times, and every single time I visited Yad Vashem. Mm-hmm. And my first time visiting Yad Vashem was my first connection between, and I don't like to play trauma Olympics and compare to different traumas. But for me, it was the first moment where I emotionally connected with the Jewish people, right? I remember looking down at the shoes of the children from the Holocaust and thinking back to the shoes that I had seen from little girls in the church that was burned. And so we don't have the same exact history, but we have a very similar story. One's way more modern than the other. That like I said, there's many differences, but our traumas are very, very similar. And the reality is, we're fighting against the same ideas of supremacy. And when we say white supremacy, we have to, unpack that and expand it a little bit further. As Bell Hooks would say, it's not just white supremacy; it's white supremacist patriarchal capitalism that we're fighting against. Mm-hmm. Not just the idea of the white race being supreme. Even the basis of the foundation of this country, we're looking at our Constitution. It did not look like me. It did not look like you. It did not look like the rabbi, because at the time that this country was founded, it was founded with the idea of white Christian straight men in mind, right? Everyone else outside of that category really didn't fit into the foundation.
Sure. Yeah, when I share about that, Wendell, I share that hierarchy is white heterosexual Christian males at the top, and everybody else right under that, of course, white heterosexual Christian women or females, and you have this hierarchy, and it keeps going. I do want to ask you though, because one of the things that we often experience tension about is the economic imbalance, often between Black people and Jewish people, that we experience these traumas and these atrocities, but somehow in this nation, where Black people, African people were enslaved, there's still a disconnect and a gap between our communities, between Black communities and Jewish communities in terms of economics. And the question becomes, is there a way that we can bridge that gap and ensure that there's not this economic disparity? Because I know when I'm hearing the things that people are saying, sometimes they're saying them rather ignorantly. But as we talk about in nonviolence, I have to go dig down and say, what are they trying to talk about? And I think it gets back to this sense that there's an economic status that our Jewish neighbors have been able to attain. And we're still looking at a lot of times in Black communities, they're marginalized and they're not experiencing economic success. And then you have environmental injustice and these different things coming in. And the tension becomes real when you look at those things. How do we address? Is there a way that Black and Jewish communities can come together to ensure that there's a bridging of that gap. And I'll give you another example. Dr. King, in a video that we share a lot on social media, he talks about how there was a kind of reparations for other groups. And there was a giving of land to European settlers, but that was denied to Black people. And sometimes when I'm hearing and I'm studying, I'm seeing that there was a reconciliation of reparations in a lot of cases for Jewish people, but not for Black people. And that causes tension. And it causes a sense of, I think, sometimes mistrust. What do we do with that? How can we be honest about it? And then how can we work on it as communities?
You know, we could literally spend a whole semester or two just unpacking that question alone.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, the reality is there is an anti-Semitic trope that all Jews are rich. We know that the reality is that all Jews are not rich. I have plenty of Jewish friends, and I will tell you that all of them are not rich. Some of them are, but most of them are not. There is an economic unbalance, and it goes back to what you talked about. Part of it is a system of reparations, and I know most people don't like to use the R word, but
it is like a dirty word, isn't
it? Look, it's like you know, it's like calling somebody out their name. Right, but the system of reparations is one that, of all the groups in America, Black people have not experienced, right? And I hear my friends tell me, oh, well, you know, you guys got affirmative action, but we really didn't, right? You got integration, but we really didn't. And so, you know, part of it is to truthfully acknowledge that African Americans have not experienced reparations in this country while other groups have, right? The other part is when we're talking about specifically about reparations for the Jewish community, that of particularly those who were survivors of the Holocaust. Understand that their reparations did not come from one single nation. They came from multiple nations. Let's acknowledge that first.
Mm-hmm.
And they had someone to turn to reparations to that wasn't their own nation state, right? African Americans, who will we turn to for reparations? We'd be turning to the United States itself from its foundation. We also have to turn to Britain and France and other countries as well.
Denmark. Yeah.
Listen, I was like you. I visited Ghana last year, and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about British colonialism and the impacts of British colonialism across the world, right? From Africa to Asia, and even here in the Americas. And I'm thinking there's a lot of repair work that has to happen. Right?
Absolutely.
It's reparations. We have to realize that we can't blame our Jewish counterparts for the fact that they have received their reparations. What we have to do, in history tells us that we do well when we do this, is learn from our Jewish counterparts and what they have done successfully. The other thing that you talk about, bridging the gaps and relieving the tension economically, also is being open to learn what our Jewish counterparts have done. Again, we can't blame them for the reparations they received. But I'm going to put another word out there. My friends and my colleagues hear me say this word all the time, and that's strategy, right? Mm-hmm. What is our strategy? How are we moving forward as a community? What, I hear people say, what are your list of demands? Where are you? We have to come together as a community, as a community. And also, we're not a monolith. Black people are not a monolith. We're not one isolated community. We're so faceted, but what is our strategy towards us receiving reparations? What does that look like? Does it come in the form of education? Does it come in the form of housing? And, you referred to the, we're talking earlier about where do we go from here? I jokingly tell people that the meat of the book is actually not within the beginning portion. It's in the appendix. Mm-hmm. Dr. King goes into full on talking about recommendations for a solution, right? I think that in modern time, what we lacked that the 1960s had, 1950s, 60s, and 70s had, is our collective strategy.
Absolutely.
And that's what, in this moment in time, and also realizing, as you mentioned earlier, the importance of us maintaining allies and building coalitions with the others, right? Those who are not just like us, don't look like us, don't have the exact same struggle as us, right? But when we build those coalitions with other people, we understand how we might make progress collectively.
Listen, brother, between you and the rabbi, I need 5 hours. They telling me we got to wrap up this segment. I'm like, I need to talk to Wendell for another. Because we're getting to a combination of what Rabbi shared and what you shared, the heart of it, I think. And one of the main things I want to highlight as we close this segment, that one of the main reasons for the tension appears to be trauma. And I just want to when we've been traumatized, we can come out of things not knowing who's responsible for the trauma, how to deal with it, how to move forward. Then you said a keyword, strategy, and we want to get to that as we close out our conversations. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing and for the honesty and for guiding us in dealing with some difficult concepts. I think what we talked about, it will just lead people at home, what Rabbi Jason shared and what you shared, to think about it more and to explore it more. Thank you, Wendell.
Thank you.
Wow. See, we're getting somewhere. We're getting somewhere. Our third segment of this conversation, in addition to, this will be our fourth segment, including Dr. Bernice A. King. It's with Dr. Will Gravely, who's a pastor, a scholar, and the founder of the Stained Glass Project. He does a lot of reconciliation work, as I call it, true reconciliation work in faith-based communities and in other communities. I want to welcome on now Dr. Will Gravely. Dr. Will, what are you thinking about this conversation? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. It's extremely rich, and I love that we have kind of gotten from the social components that kind of fostered the tension, and then we started to get into this bit about strategy toward the end with my Morehouse brother Wendell. And so it's been extremely rich and empowering.
As we consider what Rabbi Jason has shared and what Wendell shared, I'm intrigued because as Rabbi Jason was speaking, I meant to mention it. One of my most favorite concepts from the Jewish community is similar to me to the idea of the beloved community, repair the world. This idea that we can repair the world. So to go from Rabbi Jason to Wendell, and we're talking about reparations, which to me, reconciliation includes justice. It includes reparations, which to me is just repairing, whether that's economic reparations or spiritual reparations, emotional reparations, relational. However we do that, we need some repairing. We can repair the world and create the beloved community. I want to close out these individual segments before we all come back together with just your thoughts on, as we pull it all together, what would that look like for us strategically? You do strategic work. You bring together collaborations and coalitions. And Dr. King mentioned it again, we got a lot of questions, and I think we're all tired and we're all traumatized. As she was talking, I just started tearing up because to hear her say she's tired, and it's over 50 years after her father was assassinated, working on these same issues. Sometimes I just weep about that because she's saying there's a way out, but we haven't tapped into it. What's some of the strategy we can employ in engaging each other, particularly for this conversation as Black and Jewish people, to learn from each other, to grow together, to challenge each other, to say, hey, let's get this right. Let's move forward to create the beloved community.
Right. Well, that's excellent. I think even before we start to talk about practices, I think the key first step is proximity. It's proximity, right? So we look back at the 60s. In urban centers, we were literal neighbors, right? In many cities and urban areas, our neighborhoods, although they might have looked homogenous ethnically, we were neighbors to one another, right? So there were opportunities to bump into one another. There were opportunities to collaborate and have shared space. As we have kind of journeyed apart, both figuratively and literally, we've lost proximity with each other, right? And so when you lose proximity, one of the problems is we start to operate by general caricatures and not genuine connection. So as we move closer together, we get to know who one another actually is. We get to hear one another's stories and avoid one of the other things that happens when we lack proximity, which is kind of the suffering Olympics, right? And I think Wendell
Mm-hmm.
mentioned a reference to that. We need to move away from the suffering Olympics and start to move into sincere empathy, right? Just for suffering in general. And I think that's where kind of the components of Rabbi Jason's conversation about what role do people of faith play, faith leaders, faith communities play. It's this call to compassion, and not an empty compassion, right? To truly weep with those who weep and mourn with
Mm-hmm.
those who mourn, even as we
Compassionate
celebrate with
action.
those. Exactly right.
Mm.
Right. So I think we need to get back to this notion of proximity, and where it's not readily available, we need to create shared space.
Shared space. You do that. This community hub and I know I have had the opportunity to share space with you. That's very important. I think not just to you practically, but spiritually. How do you get that across to people? How would we, as we asked, we could say why all the tension and put like different communities there, because between different communities, there's tension.
Right.
So when we talk about tension, we sometimes think it's a bad thing. But what happens when we share space? What do we realize? Even as we're in this conversation, what are some of the things we're realizing about the tension that exists between Black and Jewish communities?
Yeah. First, I think the tension is good. The tension is healthy. To your point, when we don't have proximity, we don't get to feel the tension. We don't even know that it exists, right?
Mhm.
And so, in coming together, we start to recognize that once there was a deep sense of partnership, and I think the shift out of that happened around the 70s, maybe, when this notion of whiteness was something that the Jewish community was able to assimilate into. And that's when I believe this gap that you spoke of
Mhm.
economically and just status in general began to take root. But even as far as creating shared space, we have to look at what our real goal is and kind of put our agendas to the side. So, like, for example, faith communities. I was a part of some interfaith work when I first started my master's at Candler. And so they had Jewish folks, Christian folks, and Muslim folks. And so my naive assumption was, oh, the Christians and the Jews would naturally link together. And to my surprise back then, the Muslim folks and the Jewish folks linked up, because the common shared assumption, which was actually fairly accurate, was that Christians are all over the place. And at least there's some concrete culture that we can share and observe and honor amongst ourselves, right? And so I think when we go to share spaces, we have to get away from this notion of theological conversion and get back to this notion of sociological connection. Like, we don't need to get together to try to win someone over. We need to get together to learn
Mm.
about someone, right? To learn from someone and about someone. And I think that'll help us kind of get over this hump of fighting from cultural hubris to getting this notion of this beloved community or this collective humanity, right? And so we have to check our motives at the door. I think another thing in sharing space is to be careful about unspoken expectations. And even
Mm.
in this faith space, unspoken expectations of faith. If we're not careful in this kind of pedagogy of conversion, we'll end up in a crusade rather than landing in community, right? So it shouldn't be about conversion. It should be about connection. And rather than having like these unspoken expectations about faith, we should have unswerving expressions of faith, which is loving our
Mm.
neighbor, loving our enemy, right? Weeping with those who weep. So I think those are some of the key components that drive us as we are kind of failing forward in seeing the beloved community realized in our own way.
Wow. Dr. Will, when Rabbi Jason mentioned, he talked about oppressive identities. And he
Mhm.
said, more often than not, when he's with Christians, he's not the oppressive identity
Mhm.
as a Jewish person. Christians would be. And I thought about how that could be more or less if it's a Black Christian. Like there's so many
Mhm.
types of intersectionality, and the way that we can see, for instance, when we celebrate the 19th Amendment, white women
Mhm.
could vote, but Black women
Mhm.
still couldn't
Right.
vote. And I have a dear friend who's a gay male who I was telling him, I was joking. I said, I'm getting out of here. I'm moving to this country. And I said, you should come with me. And he said, I can't go there. You be okay. There's an African nation. He said,
Wow.
you be okay there, but they kill gay men in that country.
Mm.
And it caused me to start to think about, even I in that moment had like privilege where, if you want to call it that, I call it some other things, you know, when people are oppressed that I'm not so sure privilege is the right word for it. But how do we examine all of these different, I think part of the tension is we're not clear on, and we're not talking about the manifestations of trauma and suffering in all of our communities. And this has become more and more important to me, we're not tapping into each other's joy. We don't experience joy together. It's often because we're fighting this common monster of white supremacy that if a success happens for one group, we're thinking it's not happening for us. So it pits us against each other. And when you talk about shared spaces, can we just elaborate more on, as we close out this segment, that proximity, what it means to be together, to have these difficult conversations where, did they just mention economics and reparations and Jewish people and Black people and oppressive identities, and they did it all in a Beloved Community Talks, and nobody stormed off the set offended, walked off the conversation? How are we doing this? What is it about this conversation that needs to happen across the world?
Yeah, that's a profound question. I think one way we might approach answering it is recognizing we have multiple identifiers, all of us as human beings, and to realize that these different identifiers have power dynamics involved, right? So even as you talked about your dear friend of the LGBTQ plus community, and you were like, hey, let's move over here. And they said, wait a minute, I wouldn't have such a good go in that context. We realize that we do have to leverage whatever successes or wins that we've experienced on behalf of letting others come into that shared experience, right? And I think what happened is over time, as the movement splintered, these individual pockets of identity tried to leverage power dynamics for their own success, to the dismay of all other people's, right? And so I started to realize that a lot of us aren't fighting against oppression. We're fighting against oppression of ourselves, and we kind of want the same power dynamics, right? We just want to be in a position of power. So it's not that we're against oppression, we're against oppression of our people. And that's what I think fights against even the shared proximity and shared spaces we have is when we're around each other. I'll say that in the affirmative, we begin to have a collective identity amongst ourselves, and that us versus them starts to slowly become a we. And then we as a people, however wide that circle is drawn, can begin to work together and fight for one another on our collective behalf. And some are graced enough to be able to draw that as wide as the world when it comes to the beloved community and our family of humanity. And others just need to do it with the neighbor next door.
That's so essential. That understanding the importance of that question. Do you care about my oppression and my pain? Do I care about your oppression, the ways that you may be marginalized, the ways that you may be hurt and harmed in the world? Do we care about that for each other? In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., are we self-centered or other-centered? Right. Which doesn't mean I don't care about myself. It just means that I'm not willing to hurt other people for my own self-interest or to not care about other people. It's a very important concept. These are such great conversations, individual segments. We want to bring Rabbi Jason and Wendell back on now to close out our conversation. If you're like me, I mean, you're just like, do we have 2 more hours? Well, Dr. Bernie C. King can tell you, when I start talking about these things and then get into the solutions, it could be 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm saying, but what about, we could do this. Let's plan for this. Let's make this happen. Can the 3 of you get together? Like, could we do like some type of collaborative piece? When we end these conversations, I'm often thinking we had a great talk, but can the people who talk to each other start to say, Let's plan something together. Let's get in shared space together. Let's talk about economics together. Let's share strategy. Let's talk about repairing the world, which I meant to mention that to you again, Rabbi Jason, because I've done some work with that organization, Repair the World. And whenever I just mention the name, I think, wow, what a great name for an organization, and how closely aligned with creating the beloved community that is. What can we do from here? Where do we go from here? With this conversation, what do you think the next steps would be based on what people have heard in this beloved community talks? Anyone can start.
I'll just jump in quickly. I think there needs to be a collective mourning over Ma'afa and the Holocaust. I think we see them as divergent stories of differing peoples, and there's no shared grief for one another and with one another, right? And so that's where I think the tension comes from, in centering our own pain, right? All we know is our pain. All we feel is our pain. All we see is through the lens of our trauma. And so what would it look like to wear the glasses of someone else, to see through the lens of someone else, and from that place of shared pain, start to live a life of empathy and start to build community in that way?
Thank you.
I think, Dr. Gravely, you hit it on the head as you talked about public grieving. I had the opportunity to participate in a program in New Orleans at Xavier University with the JCRC and some other folks. And we're talking about intergenerational trauma, right, of both the African American and Jewish communities. And one thing we do know is that for certain communities, there exists the idea of public grieving, right? We have, there are international days of remembrance. We have that. The African American community really does not have that, but I think that collectively, if we focused on the idea, and I'm not saying sitting and suffering and resting in our grieving, but I think it is important as a historian. It's important for us to honor our history of where it is that we've come from, and because that gives a point of reference of how much progress we've actually made. But actual actions, what type of courageous actions, as Dillard University might say, how can we courageously act in this moment? I think that part of it involves mostly taking on the idea of explaining our histories to younger generations of African Americans and Jews. Older generations get it. I work with a lot of interfaith communities, and it's primarily older people, people who would have some type of tangible remembrance of what occurred in the 1960s. Younger generations are distant from it. The proximity is just not there. Right. They see themselves in a more intense setting. So the opportunity for perhaps younger Jewish communities to be able to visit places like the Legacy Museum in Alabama, opportunity to visit the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., the opportunity for young African Americans. We take groups of students to Yad Vashem every summer, and it's impactful. Right. This is the real tangible actions that can actually take place and actually make an impact. Because I can tell you that when people understand and they see themselves in close proximity to another group of people, when they see themselves through the lens or see themselves in the shoes of someone else, then they tend to be able to understand a little bit more the importance of being in a coalition with that other group of people.
Rabbi.
Yeah. I'll talk about what I'd like to see my own community doing more of, which is the conversation about reparations and truth and reconciliation. As a community that has had an experience where perpetrators have actually taken responsibility and made some effective at repair, and that came in the form of tangible monetary reparations as well as a true, I think, I believe it is true. Everything I'm reading about, what German culture has done in the last several generations. There's a real taking stock that has not happened in this country in any way. And, in my mind, and many Jewish denominations have gone on the record and said, yes, we'll say reparations. We agree with that. We support it, et cetera. That's good. But there should be so much more energy there. There should be so much that, like we have an experience that this is needed and important. And here we are living in a society where many of us have benefited from whiteness. And so we have a particular experience that I think can be a powerful voice on that issue.
Yeah. And I think that becomes a central question. How can we be voices for each other in this work, in tangible work, the conversations we want to have, the mourning, and then also bridging some of these economic gaps, working together, strategizing around that, ensuring that these injustices don't continue in this country and abroad. I want to close with this kind of thought around repairing the world and the beloved community, because sometimes people think that we can't care about one group of people several groups of people at the same time, that if there's conflict between two groups, then we have to choose. And I think that's some of the things we're seeing today. I often face when I'm talking to people. If I say to them one day, goodness, I'm mourning that synagogue was blown up on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And the day before I said, my goodness, that's terrible. Truly, that Palestinian people died in that raid. People think I have different personalities or something, but I think what we have to do in creating the beloved community is have capacity to just care about people. And I think the trauma we talked about, the oppressive identities, the understanding where we are in different phases and different places in our lives, and the proximity. I'm so grateful to each of you. And I think you've shared some very honest, truthful things about what we can do, not to get rid of the tension, because I think we wouldn't have come together to talk about this if we didn't realize there was some tension. As Dr. King said in a letter from Birmingham jail, there's nothing wrong with the tension. It's what we do with it. And I'm honored always to be a part of the King Center, where we take the tension and try to work something good out of it, and hopefully get to justice. So I believe that this tension, when we explore it and deal with it, can lead to some justice. And justice meaning, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, in one place he said, is love correcting everything that stands against love. In another space, I believe, I heard it somewhere, I just can't get back to it, but people use this one more often, power correcting everything that stands against love. Either way, he believed that love and power should work jointly to get us to where we need to be. And I think this conversation has been a reminder of that. And we want to stay connected to you. Can we do that? Can we meet up again and connect and say, what do we do with all we've talked about, so we just don't leave it here? I want to give each of you the opportunity to just share a closing word statement as we end this great beloved community talks. We'll start with you, Wendell. Thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation, and while I was backstage, had the opportunity to do some quick research on where everyone's located, and looking forward to making those connections. Even after this, I think it's important that we continue to courageously act in this moment and cultivate the beloved community. And so I think you're right, Dr. Reston. I think you're right. I know you're right. As we say down here, sure, you're right. Tension is not only relevant, but it's necessary. Tension is where we grow from, right? And you know, as we have to decide, where do we grow? Not only where do we go from here, but where do we grow from here, right? What type of progress can we make collectively? But I do know is that it involves each and every person who's not just on the screen right now in this moment, but those who are tuned in, those who will watch the recording, and those who will never even have an opportunity to watch this recording or know about what we're talking about.
Absolutely.
It involves every single person who has the ability to act.
Thank you so much. Rabbi?
It's been an honor to be part of this conversation and in relationship with each of you, and I look forward to continuing it.
Thank you, Rabbi Jason. Dr. Will?
Yeah, likewise, it's been an honor. I look forward to continuing this work. And I just want us to remember that the tension is good. It's literally how our muscles are strengthened.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to each of you for tuning in, for being a part of this conversation. I thank you to Dr. Bernice A. King for being a leader who wants us to have these courageous conversations that get us to transforming unjust systems. We want you to share this talk with people in your circle, people outside your circle, and help us get this out there that in the tension, as Dr. Will just said, there's a stretching. And we don't want to stay in the tension always, not that same tension, but we want it to help us grow. And then we get to the place where we say, I am for you, you are for me. And we start to deconstruct and transform these systems that are harming us, realize the ways we're complicit in these systems, then have some more courageous conversations that lead to some more work, and just keep building and building and building, from our coalitions to our corporations, our schools, our city halls. There's a critical work that must be done. And we invite you to learn more about how to do that work via Nonviolence 365 online. Go to the KingCenterInstitute.org to study nonviolence, to learn how it works, the principles and the steps. Because in that tension, there's some principles and steps, there's a philosophy and methodology that can help us navigate it in a way that we don't become the monsters that we're seeking to destroy. When I say monsters, I don't mean people. I mean ideologies, evil forces, the things that try to make us diminish our capacity to love and care for each other as human beings. Thank you to all of you for joining in. Thank you for watching. Please share. Please tweet about this, share the broadcast to get it out there to people. Host a watch party. But let's keep these courageous conversations going.
Impact, effect, influence. The King Center's 2022 experiences, programs, messaging, and initiatives were derived from our theme for the year. It starts with me, shifting priorities to create the beloved community. The King Center published a powerful children's book, It Starts With Me, which was co-authored by King Center CEO Dr. Bernice A. King and Dr. Kimberly P. Johnson. Our Dynamic Students with King program continued to influence students, educators, and schools with historical perspectives and leadership lessons from civil rights leaders, members of the King family, and friends of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King. Our combined Students with King programming reached over 800,000 youth. The Beloved Community Leadership Academy is committed to developing the next generation of compassionate, courageous, conscientious, nonviolent leaders who think critically to solve pressing world issues. The Beloved Community Leadership Academy engaged over 100 students from 5 continents. True respect, love, diversity, understanding, honor. The Beloved Community Expo attendees experienced different cultures, languages, musical performances, and food.
Hi, everybody. I just came from the U.S. I flew to Liberia. Yeah. And in 2 hours, guess what? I was in Ghana. And I just left Nigeria. I'm on my way to India. Thank you. So I will see you in India. Bye.
Building on our 50-plus year history as a leader in nonviolence training and education, the King Center launched our Nonviolence 365 e-learning course. This NV365 online masterclass, which has been translated into 6 languages and adapted into a 3-hour workplace edition, features veterans of the civil rights movement, some of Dr. King's most essential readings, speeches, and teachings, world-class instructors and practitioners of nonviolence. The King Center hosted beloved Community Talks live stream events that called humanity up to compassionate action and powerful reflection regarding the triple evils of militarism, racism, and poverty.
We have a moral responsibility to speak up, to stand up, to show up, and never shut up until all of our brothers and sisters can rise from the shackles of oppression, depression, suppression, and the real violence of poverty.
From the Poor People's Campaign Moral Assembly in Washington, D.C., to voting rights and galvanizing voters, to raising our voice for changing gun laws, the King Center and King Center CEO, Dr. Bernice A. King, carried on the legacy of our namesake and our founder of advocating for a just, humane, equitable, and peaceful world. Each of us can be great. Each of us can serve. It starts with me. It's about us. Donate to the King Center by texting MLK Give to 44321.